Whenever someone says, I have bad news and I have good news, which would you like first? I always want the bad news first. Just rip the Band-Aid off, get it out of the way so we can move on to the good news. So that's what I'm gonna do in this course. The bad news is that 50% at least of high school students actively involved in their churches will walk away from their faith after graduation. 50%. That's a coin toss. Heads, they're walking with Jesus for the rest of their lives. Tails, they're not. The first time I came across this statistic, it just gutted me. I was serving as a pastor at the time, but I also had 2 young boys. And I was like, how are we okay with this? How is this just normal for our churches? You mean to tell me that odds are that one of my boys will walk away from their faith and that half of the kids at this church won't follow Jesus as adults? And that's when my competitive side kind of kicked in. And I was like, no, not here, not at this church, not my kids. We're going to figure out how to beat this. And here's where I need to give a really important caveat. There are no guarantees here. Our kids are human beings with their own wills. When my first kid was an infant and not sleeping ever, based on my personality, I really wanted to believe if I just did the right thing, if I read his cues perfectly and put him down when he was drowsy but not overtired and never woke him up and sleep begets sleep and all of that, if I just followed this system perfectly, he would sleep. And my husband would gently remind me, Sarah, he's not a robot, he's a human being. And the same is true about discipleship. We cannot, by our own efforts, manufacture perfect little disciples. We can't program our kids to follow Jesus. We can do all the right things, and they still might choose a different path. They aren't robots, they are humans, and so are we. We aren't God. And so we need to remember this, especially if we tend to lean towards the shame quadrant. But we are invited to participate with the Holy Spirit in the mysterious work of discipleship. And our participation matters. Spoiler alert, we absolutely can beat that 50% stat, and we'll get to that eventually. For now, let's dive a little deeper into the bad news and talk about how we got here. I learned how to drive before GPS. Maybe some of you remember what that was like. I was not born with a sense of direction. It's just something the Lord did not give me. I do not have a sense of spatial intelligence. And so when I was learning how to drive, I got lost all the time. And my dad just felt so sorry that this wasn't something he could teach me. And he would say, oh, I wish I could just get you a homing pigeon to leave in your car so that whenever you get lost, you could open the window, let the thing out, and follow it home. In 2004, when TomTom came out with the first personal GPS device, he mailed me one. I was an adult by that point and said, finally, your homing pigeon. Before that point, whenever I drove alone, I made sure I had my Massachusetts Street Atlas and an ashtray full of quarters. Getting lost was a regular experience, and drivers who learned how to drive after 2004, I think, do not understand this. And usually, I wouldn't know I was lost until what I was seeing out my window didn't match up with where I expected to find myself. For example, when I was in college and my parents lived in Massachusetts and I went to school in Rhode Island, I had to take the highway to get back to school. And one time I was leaving their house and I got on the highway to go back to school, and I'm driving along, enjoying the ride, expecting that any moment I will see the Providence skyline come into view. When all of a sudden, I started to see signs for New Hampshire. I had gone north when I should have gone south. The worst part is that this happened not once, but twice. I was going the wrong way, blissfully unaware, until suddenly there's the New Hampshire border. Sometimes we don't even realize we're lost until what we're seeing out the window doesn't match up with where we intended to go or where we expected to find ourselves. And when it comes to this conversation, I am fully convinced that we in the Western church have gotten ourselves lost. Pastors and ministry leaders, we've been driving along doing good, faithful ministry. We're not terrible drivers, we're great drivers. Parents, we've been doing our best to get our kids to church and Sunday school and VBS, but we've been on the wrong road for a while. And I think many of us have been blissfully unaware of just how lost we've become. But then all of a sudden, there's this giant highway sign that we can't unsee. And it's not the New Hampshire border, but it's this 50% statistic. When it comes to the discipleship of children and youth, we in the Western church are lost. I remember countless times pre-GPS pulling over, pulling out the map and asking, how the heck did I get here? Where did I go wrong? What was my wrong turn? And there are lots of answers to that question when it comes to this topic. Lots of places I think we've taken wrong turns, little ones and big ones, that have brought us here. I have a lot of opinions about this actually, but I'll share just a couple here. One wrong turn is what I would call the professionalization of the priesthood. One of the primary doctrines of the Reformation was the idea of the priesthood of all believers, liberating the work of ministry from a small elite class of priests and inviting every Christian to join God in the work of renewal in their daily lives, the work of discipleship and evangelism and justice. And most pastors and ministry leaders would say, amen. Yes, priesthood of all believers. We believe that. But when you look at the way many churches in the U.S. are structured and operate, you wouldn't necessarily know that this is something we care about because you still often see the work of ministry being done by a small handful of professional clergy. To use a sports metaphor for a moment, it's like the congregation is up in the stands watching as the clergy run plays on the field. Now, the problem is not professional clergy. We need professional clergy. The problem is that we've professionalized the work of discipleship. We've professionalized the work of ministry that belongs in the hands of every believer. At my church, Sanctuary Church in Providence, we talk about wanting to see the congregation on the field, with the clergy serving as the coaching staff, the medics, and even the cheerleaders. And when it comes to children and family ministry, this dynamic lines up perfectly with a cultural parenting norm, which is that parents tend to outsource the development of their kids to experts when they want them to be good at something. If I want my kid to be good at math, I hire a math tutor. If I want my kid to be good at soccer, I get them on a good team with the best coach. And so when the church doesn't structurally or programmatically live into the doctrine of the priesthood of all believers, it makes perfect sense that parents would apply the same logic to discipleship. And that's where we get parents who drop their kids off and say, you disciple them. That's your job, isn't it? So you may relate to this wrong turn either as a parent or as a pastor or ministry leader. And then here's another big one that applies to all of us. Prior to the turn of the 21st century, with respect to Christianity, there were only two types of cultures in the world. What we might call non-Christian cultures, societies with no historic Christian influence, and those we would call Christendom, societies where Christianity has exerted strong cultural influence in the past. But for the first time in human history, the 21st century has brought about the emergence of a third type of culture in Western societies, what scholars refer to as post-Christian culture. What is unique about post-Christian culture is that it is a reaction to Christendom. It's a culture that is familiar with Christianity but has rejected it. Think about how most vaccines work. They work by exposing the human body to enough of a virus, a weakened version of that virus, to enable the immune system to defend itself against it. This is called inoculation. In the same way, post-Christian cultures have been exposed to enough of the gospel through Christendom, a weakened version of it usually, to defend itself against Christianity. Here are a few characteristics of post-Christian culture that you may be very familiar with. There's a particular skill and even pleasure in deconstructing the Christian worldview. There's an interest or desire in the values of the kingdom, justice, the dignity of all human beings, but without the authority or presence of the king. There's an almost pharisaical judgmentalism towards the way of Jesus when it cuts against the grain of mainstream culture. And there's a sense that the moral high ground has shifted from the religious sector to the secular sector. For example, the Christian sexual ethic used to be seen as peculiar, perhaps, but a generally moral way to live. When I was in high school in the 90s, and I was dating somebody and not sleeping with them, that was an unusual choice, but it was always something that my friends respected. And there was sometimes even a little head patting of, Sarah, you're such a good person. You're such a moral person. I wish I could be good like you. If our kids choose to adhere to the Christian sexual ethic, you can bet that no one is going to tell them that they are good or moral. They are going to be told that they are repressed, that this is harmful even to believe the things that they believe. So what this means for our discussion is that our children today are growing up in a world that is discipling them in these post-Christian distinctives. And I say that as a completely neutral fact. It actually doesn't bother me that much because Christendom offered its own unique challenges to discipleship. Every culture offers challenges to discipleship. So please don't hear me saying, I want to go back there. What's troubling to me is not this shift in culture, but it's how the church generally has responded to this reality. I'm less concerned about post-Christian culture than I am about the church's response to post-Christian culture. The church's response to this shift is the wrong turn. Honestly, it's the same response as that of a threatened animal. Fight, flight, or camouflage. First, fight. These are the culture war churches who have tried to hold on to Christendom's declining cultural power by battling it out in courtrooms and voting booths. Next, flight. These are the foxhole churches who have evacuated mainstream culture in favor of monocultural Christian environments. There are definitely times and seasons when some degree of cloistering is helpful, but when we full on evacuate from culture, we run the risk of losing our missional edge and our love for the lost. And then lastly, camouflage. These are the churches who have sought to blend into the shifting culture and have adopted many of the values, attitudes, and even theological perspectives of the post-Christian milieu. None are sufficient to help our children to walk the way of Jesus confidently in the midst of a world that doesn't. None are sufficient to get us to the destination we're aiming for. There has to be another way, and we'll get into that in the next 2 sessions. In my pre-GPS life, one of the worst parts of getting lost was that initial sense of impending doom as I began to realize I was not on the right track. Next came the utter confusion of driving around in circles, trying to find my way back to something I recognized, a landmark, a street sign, anything. So there was always a certain sense of relief in finally deciding to pull into a gas station and admit I was lost, because that was the first step in finding my way again. My hope is that we might experience a similar sense of relief, admitting we've collectively lost our way with family discipleship. The truth is, we didn't mean to end up here with 50% of our kids walking away from Jesus as adults. So it's okay, and hopefully even a little liberating, to admit that we are lost. This isn't working, and we need some help getting back on the right path.